Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. This whole mess started about 2 years ago when my wife and I bought our dream house in what seemed like a perfect suburban neighborhood. The houses were well maintained, the streets were clean, and the HOA fees seemed reasonable at $150 a month. What I didn't realize was that I was walking into the kingdom of a petty tyrant who would eventually lose everything because of his own greed. A little background about me. I work in risk assessment for a mid-sized financial firm. My job is basically to look at numbers, find patterns, and identify when something doesn't add up. I spend my days analyzing debt structures, loan documents, and financial statements. This background would prove crucial later, but at the time I was just a guy who wanted to install some eco-friendly improvements to his new house. The neighborhood itself was nice enough. Most of the houses were built in the early 2000s with that cookie-cutter suburban look that developers love. Big driveways, small front yards, and enough space between houses that you could pretend you had privacy. The HOA managed common areas like a small park and a retention pond, plus they enforced the usual rules about lawn care, paint colors, and architectural modifications. Our house needed some updates when we moved in. The previous owners had let a few things slide, and I'm the type of person who likes to fix problems before they get worse. One of the biggest issues was water runoff. Every time it rained hard, water would pool in our backyard and take forever to drain. After doing some research, I decided to install a rain capture and filtration system. It wasn't cheap, but it would solve the drainage problem and help us save on water bills. The system I chose was pretty sophisticated. It involved underground storage tanks, filtration equipment, and a network of pipes that would collect rainwater from our roof and redirect it for irrigation. The whole setup would be hidden underground except for a small control panel mounted on the side of our house. I made sure to get proper permits from the city and checked the HOA rules carefully before starting the project. Here's where things get interesting. The HOA rules required approval for any major exterior modifications, but my rain capture system had actually been pre-approved by the previous board about 6 months before we bought the house. The original homeowner had applied for the same system but never followed through with installation. When we bought the house, that approval transferred to us as part of the sale documents. I thought I was being smart by double-checking everything. I even contacted the HOA management company to confirm that our approval was still valid. They said it was fine, so we went ahead with the installation. The project took about a week, and when it was done, you could barely tell anything had changed. The only visible difference was that small control panel on the side of our house painted to match our siding. That's when I first encountered the HOA president. Let me call him Arthur, since I'm trying to keep this anonymous. Arthur was probably in his early 60s, retired from some middle management position, and he treated our neighborhood like his personal empire. He lived in the biggest house on the best corner lot, with a perfectly manicured lawn that looked like something from a magazine. Every blade of grass was exactly the same height, his hedges were trimmed with mathematical precision, and his driveway was pressure washed weekly. Arthur came by about 2 weeks after our installation was complete. He knocked on our door one morning while I was getting ready for work and introduced himself as the HOA president. He seemed friendly enough at first, welcoming us to the neighborhood and asking how we were settling in. Then his tone changed. He told me that someone had complained about our unsightly electrical box and said it violated the architectural guidelines. I explained that it was part of our rain capture system and that we had proper approval from the previous board. Arthur's whole demeanor shifted when I mentioned the previous board. Apparently there had been some kind of election controversy and Arthur's faction had taken control only recently. Arthur informed me that all previous approvals were under review and that our control panel definitely violated the current standards. He said I had 30 days to remove it or face daily fines. When I asked to see the specific rule I was violating, he got defensive and said that as president he didn't need to explain every decision to residents. That conversation should have been my first warning about what kind of person I was dealing with. Instead of backing down, I decided to research the issue more thoroughly. I pulled up all the HOA documents, read through the meeting minutes from the past year, and even looked up public records related to the board elections. What I found was interesting. Arthur had run for president on a platform of strict enforcement and maintaining property values. He'd narrowly won after a contentious election where voter turnout was unusually low. Several longtime residents had complained about his tactics, but not enough to prevent his victory. More importantly, I discovered that there was nothing in the HOA rules that specifically prohibited rain capture systems. The architectural guidelines mentioned electrical installations, but clearly referred to things like satellite dishes and outdoor lighting. My control panel was no different from an air conditioning unit or pool equipment, both of which were common throughout the neighborhood. I drafted a formal response to Arthur's complaint, citing the relevant sections of the HOA documents and including copies of our original approval paperwork. I hand-delivered it to his house, figuring that a reasonable person would accept the documentation and move on. I was wrong. 3 days later, I found a violation notice taped to my front door. Arthur had cited me for having a non-compliant external fixture and imposed a $100 daily fine starting immediately. The notice said I had 10 days to appeal the decision at the next board meeting, but that fines would continue accruing until the violation was corrected. $100 a day might not sound like much, but it adds up fast. I was looking at $3,000 a month in fines for something that was perfectly legal and pre-approved. My wife suggested we just remove the control panel to avoid the hassle, but I'm stubborn when I know I'm right. Plus, removing it would mean losing access to our rain capture system, which we'd spent thousands of dollars to install. I decided to attend the next board meeting and present my case formally. The meetings were held in a community center about 10 minutes from our neighborhood, and I showed up with a folder full of documentation. There were maybe 15 residents there, plus the 5 board members. Arthur ran the meeting like he was chairing a corporate board. Everything was formal procedures and parliamentary language, which seemed ridiculous for a neighborhood HOA. When it came time for my appeal, he made me stand at a podium like I was on trial. I presented my case methodically, explaining the pre-approval process, showing the relevant rule sections, and demonstrating that our installation met all the requirements. The other board members seemed receptive, asking reasonable questions about the system and acknowledging that the paperwork looked legitimate. Then Arthur responded, and I realized this was never about rules or approvals. He launched into a speech about maintaining standards and protecting property values. He said that just because something was technically allowed didn't mean it was appropriate for our upscale community. He mentioned that our neighborhood had some of the highest property values in the area and that residents who couldn't appreciate that lifestyle might be happier somewhere else. The condescending tone was bad enough, but then he really crossed the line. Arthur suggested that people who needed to cut corners with gray market drainage systems probably couldn't afford to maintain their homes properly anyway. He said that allowing makeshift installations would turn our neighborhood into a trailer park. I kept my cool during the meeting, but I was furious. This wasn't about rules or property values. Arthur was using his position to bully residents who didn't fit his vision of the perfect neighborhood. The other board members looked uncomfortable, but none of them challenged him directly. The vote was 3-2 to uphold the violation, with Arthur's allies providing the majority. I was ordered to remove the control panel within 15 days or face continuing fines plus additional penalties for willful non-compliance. Walking back to my car, I was already planning my next move. Arthur had made this personal, and he'd chosen the wrong person to mess with. My job involves analyzing financial risk, and I'd learned to spot vulnerability from across a spreadsheet. Arthur might think he was untouchable as HOA president, but everyone has pressure points. That night, I started doing some research, not just on HOA rules and legal precedents, but on Arthur himself. Public records are amazing things if you know where to look. Property records, tax filings, court documents, business registrations, all of it available to anyone willing to spend the time searching. What I found was fascinating. Arthur's house was impressive from the outside, but the financial picture was much more complicated. He'd bought it 8 years ago for $480,000, which was reasonable for the neighborhood at the time. But then he'd refinanced multiple times, pulling out equity for renovations and lifestyle expenses. His current mortgage balance was over $520,000 on a house that might be worth $550,000 in a good market. That alone wasn't unusual, but there was more. Arthur had taken out a second mortgage 2 years ago for $75,000, calling it a home equity line of credit. Then, 6 months ago, he'd taken out what looked like a bridge loan for another $60,000. Bridge loans are short-term, high-interest financing that's supposed to be paid back quickly. They're usually used when someone is buying a new house before selling their old one, or when they need cash fast for some other reason. The terms on Arthur's bridge loan were particularly nasty. It was a 12-month note at 18% interest with a balloon payment due at the end. Do the math. Arthur owed over $650,000 on a house worth maybe $550,000. He was underwater by six figures, and that bridge loan payment was coming due in about 6 months. Unless he could refinance or come up with $60,000 plus interest, he was heading for foreclosure. But here's where it got really interesting. I cross-referenced the dates on Arthur's loans with the HOA financial records, which are public documents that have to be filed with the county. There was a pattern that made my risk assessment instincts start tingling. Every time Arthur took out new debt, the HOA seemed to have some kind of special assessment or emergency expense that required additional funds from residents. New landscaping projects, legal fees, infrastructure improvements, all of it happening right around the same time Arthur was refinancing his house. Now, I'm not saying Arthur was stealing money directly. The HOA records looked legitimate on the surface, but there were irregularities that any decent auditor would flag immediately. Invoices from vendors that couldn't be verified, payments to consulting companies with no clear business purpose, legal expenses that seemed excessive for a neighborhood association. Arthur had been president for almost 2 years, and during that time the HOA's reserve fund had shrunk from over $100,000 to less than $20,000. Meanwhile, HOA fees had increased twice, and residents were being hit with more and more violation fines. That's when it clicked. Arthur wasn't just a power-hungry control freak. He was broke, and he was using his position to generate cash flow. Every fine he collected went into HOA accounts that he controlled. Every inflated vendor payment probably had a kickback component. He'd turned our neighborhood association into his personal piggy bank, but the bridge loan was the key. That $60,000 was coming due whether Arthur had the money or not. If he defaulted, the lender could force a sale of his house. Arthur was desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. I spent the next few days putting together a complete financial profile of Arthur's situation. The bridge loan had been issued by a small commercial lending company that specialized in high-risk, short-term financing. These guys weren't a bank with layers of bureaucracy. They were basically sophisticated loan sharks who charged premium rates for quick money. That gave me an idea, a really good idea. Instead of fighting Arthur's violation fines through the HOA appeals process, I was going to take a different approach. I was going to buy his debt. Now, purchasing someone else's debt isn't something most people think about, but it happens all the time in the financial world. Credit card companies sell delinquent accounts to collection agencies. Mortgage lenders sell portfolios of loans to other banks. Usually, debt gets sold when the original lender wants to reduce their risk or free up capital for new investments. Arthur's bridge loan was exactly the type of debt that lenders are happy to sell. It was high risk, short term, and secured only by a house that was already over-leveraged. If Arthur defaulted, the lender would have to go through foreclosure proceedings, which are expensive and time-consuming. Much easier to sell the note to someone else and let them deal with the headaches. I reached out to the lending company through a business contact at my firm. I explained that I represented an investment group interested in purchasing performing and non-performing real estate debt. It was technically true. I was an investment group of one, and I was very interested in Arthur's particular debt. The initial conversation went better than I'd hoped. The lending company was indeed interested in selling the note. Arthur had been making his payments on time, but they considered him a high default risk because of his overall debt situation. They were willing to sell the $60,000 note for $52,000, which represented about a 13% discount. $52,000 was a lot of money, but it was manageable with our savings and a small loan against my 401k. More importantly, it would give me complete control over Arthur's financial future. If he couldn't make his balloon payment in 6 months, I could foreclose on his house. Even if he did make the payment, I'd earn 18% interest on my investment. But I wanted to be completely sure about the legal aspects before moving forward. I consulted with a real estate attorney who specialized in debt transactions. She explained that once I purchased the note, I would have all the rights and responsibilities of the original lender. I could modify the terms, demand early payment, or initiate foreclosure proceedings if Arthur defaulted. The attorney also confirmed something I'd suspected. If Arthur had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, he could face criminal charges for embezzlement. More importantly, any criminal conviction would probably violate the terms of his bridge loan, giving me grounds to call the note immediately. Everything was falling into place. I had Arthur's financial profile, a plan to acquire his debt, and evidence of potential criminal activity. All I needed was patience and careful timing. I set up an LLC to handle the debt purchase, keeping my name off the public records. The transfer took about 2 weeks to complete, including all the paperwork and title searches. When it was done, I was officially Arthur's creditor. He owed me $60,000 plus 18% annual interest, with full payment due in about 4.5 months. Arthur had no idea what had happened. The lending company was required to notify him that his debt had been transferred, but the notice just listed my LLC's name and address. There was nothing to connect it back to me personally. Meanwhile, I let Arthur keep playing his little power games with the HOA fines. Every day that passed, my violation charges increased by $100. Arthur was probably feeling pretty good about himself, thinking he'd beaten down another troublesome resident. He had no idea that he was walking straight into a trap. About 3 weeks after I purchased his debt, Arthur decided to escalate things even further. I came home from work to find another violation notice, this time citing me for having my garbage cans out more than 12 hours before pickup. The fine was another $50 per day per violation. 2 days later, another notice. My mailbox flag was non-compliant because it was a different shade of red than specified in the architectural guidelines. Another $50 per day. Then it was my hedge trimming. Apparently, the height differential between different sections of my hedge exceeded the maximum variation tolerance of 2 inches, $75 per day. Arthur was clearly enjoying himself. He'd found a resident who wouldn't back down, so he was going to make an example of me. Every few days brought a new violation notice, each more ridiculous than the last. By my count, I was up to over $400 per day in fines for various infractions. The funny thing was, I didn't really care anymore. Let Arthur rack up the fines. Every dollar he collected was just moving money around between accounts I could trace. And every day that passed was 1 day closer to his balloon payment deadline. I started attending HOA board meetings regularly, not to complain about my fines, but to observe Arthur's behavior and gather more evidence. The man was clearly stressed. He'd lost weight, his usually perfect appearance was starting to slip, and he was becoming increasingly hostile toward residents who asked questions about HOA finances. During one meeting, a neighbor asked about the reserve fund balance. Arthur got defensive, claiming that the information was confidential and that residents didn't need to know specific details about HOA investments. When pressed, he said that the board had made strategic decisions to maximize returns, but that the fund was fully secure. I knew that was a lie. The reserve fund was down to less than $15,000, barely enough to cover basic maintenance for a few months. If there was any kind of emergency, like a major repair to the community center or storm damage to common areas, the HOA would be in serious financial trouble. After that meeting, I decided to accelerate my timeline. Arthur's balloon payment was still 3 months away, but I was worried he might find some way to refinance or come up with the money. I needed to force his hand while he was still vulnerable. I had my attorney send Arthur a formal notice that his debt had been purchased by my LLC. The notice included a full accounting of the amount owed and reminded him that the balloon payment was due in exactly 86 days. It also mentioned that the note contained certain covenants that the borrower was required to maintain, including good standing in the community and compliance with all applicable laws. That second part was important. If Arthur was embezzling HOA funds, he was violating the law. And if he was violating the law, I could potentially call his note early. Arthur's reaction to the debt transfer notice was immediate and predictable. He called the number on the letterhead demanding to speak with the owner of my LLC. My attorney's office handled the call and told him that all communication needed to be in writing. 2 days later, Arthur showed up at my house. I was in my garage when he pulled into my driveway. His usual calm, controlled demeanor was completely gone. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, and when he got out of his car, I could see his hands shaking. Arthur demanded to know if I was connected to the company that had bought his loan. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. He started yelling about conspiracy and harassment, claiming that I was trying to destroy him because of the HOA fines. I stayed calm and suggested that if he was having financial problems, maybe he should consider stepping down as HOA president to focus on his personal situation. That really set him off. Arthur got in my face and told me that I had no idea who I was messing with. He said he had connections throughout the county government and that he could make my life very difficult if I didn't back off. He threatened to place liens on my property, file complaints with code enforcement, and find violations on my house that would cost me thousands to fix. The whole confrontation was loud enough that several neighbors came out to see what was happening. Arthur realized he was making a scene and tried to compose himself, but the damage was done. Everyone could see that their HOA president was losing it. That evening, I got a call from another neighbor who'd witnessed the argument. She wanted to know if Arthur was having some kind of breakdown because his behavior had been getting increasingly erratic. I didn't tell her about the debt situation, but I suggested that maybe it was time for the community to take a closer look at how their HOA was being managed. Word spreads fast in suburban neighborhoods. Within a week, I was getting calls and visits from other residents who had concerns about Arthur's leadership. Some had received excessive violation fines for minor infractions. Others had questions about HOA spending and the reserve fund balance. One neighbor showed me a violation notice he'd received for parking his car on the street overnight during a family emergency. The fine was $200 per day, and Arthur had refused to grant an exception even though the man's wife had been in the hospital. Another resident had been cited for having unapproved holiday decorations after putting up Christmas lights that were allegedly the wrong color temperature. She'd spent $300 replacing them with HOA-compliant lights, only to receive another violation for having them up past the approved removal date. I started keeping a file of these complaints, documenting Arthur's pattern of excessive and arbitrary enforcement. The picture that emerged was of someone who was using HOA rules as a weapon against residents he didn't like or who questioned his authority. But the most damaging information came from a former board member who'd been pushed out during Arthur's election. She told me that Arthur had been pressuring the board to approve questionable expenses and had been secretive about financial details. When she'd asked for documentation about specific expenditures, Arthur had accused her of undermining board authority and had worked to remove her from her position. More importantly, she suspected that Arthur had been manipulating vendor contracts to generate kickbacks. Several projects had been awarded to companies with no local presence or verifiable track record. When she'd tried to investigate, Arthur had claimed that the information was confidential due to pending legal matters. With about 2 months left until Arthur's balloon payment was due, I decided it was time to start applying pressure. I had my attorney send him a formal demand for additional financial documentation required under the terms of his loan. Since his debt was secured by his house, I had the right to verify that the collateral was being properly maintained and that there were no other liens or encumbrances. The demand letter required Arthur to provide recent tax returns, updated property valuations, proof of insurance, and documentation of any other debts secured by his house. He had 30 days to comply or face potential acceleration of the loan. Arthur's response came through his own attorney, claiming that my demands were excessive and harassing. His lawyer argued that the debt transfer was invalid and that the original lender had breached their agreement by selling the note without proper notice. My attorney filed a motion to dismiss Arthur's claims, and the court scheduled a hearing for 6 weeks later. That timeline was perfect for me. The hearing would take place just 2 weeks before Arthur's balloon payment was due, giving him very little time to arrange alternative financing if the court ruled against him. While the legal proceedings were moving forward, I continued gathering evidence about Arthur's mismanagement of HOA funds. I'd put together a detailed analysis showing how reserve fund money had been depleted through questionable expenses and contract manipulation. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Over the past 18 months, the HOA had paid over $30,000 to a consulting company that existed only on paper. Another $25,000 had gone to emergency landscaping repairs that were completed by a contractor with no local business license. Legal fees had totaled nearly $20,000 for disputes that should have cost a few $1,000s at most. Each of these expenses corresponded with periods when Arthur was refinancing his house or taking out new loans. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. I compiled all of this information into a comprehensive report and sent copies to every homeowner in the neighborhood. I also forwarded it to the county sheriff's office, requesting an investigation into potential embezzlement of HOA funds. The reaction was swift and dramatic. Within days, residents were calling for Arthur's resignation and demanding a forensic audit of HOA finances. A group of homeowners organized a special election to remove Arthur from the board, citing loss of confidence in his leadership. Arthur fought back the only way he knew how, issuing violation notices to anyone who had signed the petition for his removal. But this strategy backfired spectacularly. Residents who had been neutral suddenly found themselves facing hundreds of dollars in daily fines for infractions like excessive window glare and non-compliant lawn edging patterns. The violation notices were so obviously retaliatory that several residents filed complaints with the state attorney general's office. HOAs are required to enforce rules fairly and consistently, and targeting people for political opposition is illegal in most jurisdictions. As Arthur's balloon payment deadline approached, his behavior became increasingly desperate. He tried to get a restraining order against me, claiming harassment and stalking. The judge dismissed the petition after reviewing the evidence and noting that all of my actions were legitimate business activities. Arthur's attorney withdrew from representation, apparently unwilling to continue working without payment. That left Arthur to represent himself in the debt dispute, which was scheduled for a hearing just 8 days before his payment was due. The court hearing was almost anticlimactic. Arthur argued that the debt transfer was invalid and that I was using the loan to harass him personally. The judge reviewed the documentation and found that everything had been done properly. The debt transfer was legitimate, and I had the right to collect the full balance according to the original terms. Arthur had 1 week to come up with $60,000 plus accumulated interest and fees. The total amount was now close to $68,000. And he had no realistic way to raise that kind of money quickly. I didn't hear anything from Arthur for the next 6 days. Then, on the day before his payment was due, I received a call from my attorney. Arthur was requesting a meeting to discuss alternative arrangements for his debt. We met at my lawyer's office the next morning. Arthur looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past month. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, and he had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping. Arthur's proposal was simple. He wanted me to extend the loan for another year, with modified terms that would reduce his monthly payments. In exchange, he would resign from the HOA board and drop all violation fines against me and other residents. I considered his offer for about 30 seconds before rejecting it. Arthur had made this personal when he tried to humiliate me at that board meeting. He doubled down by issuing retaliatory fines and threatening my neighbors. Now he wanted mercy he had never shown to anyone else. My attorney informed Arthur that the full balance was due by 5 p.m. that day, as specified in the original loan documents. If payment wasn't received, I would begin foreclosure proceedings immediately. Arthur made one last desperate attempt to save his house. He offered to sell me his house directly for $540,000, which would pay off his various mortgages and give him enough left over to avoid bankruptcy. It wasn't a bad offer from a purely financial perspective, but I had something else in mind. I told Arthur that I wasn't interested in buying his house for $540,000, but I would be very interested in buying it at a foreclosure auction for whatever price the market would support. 5 o'clock came and went with no payment from Arthur. The next morning, I filed the necessary paperwork to begin foreclosure proceedings. In our state, the process takes about 90 days from filing to final sale, assuming the borrower doesn't cure the default. Arthur didn't have $68,000, so curing the default wasn't an option. He could try to file bankruptcy to delay the foreclosure, but that would require him to disclose all of his financial dealings, including any misappropriation of HOA funds. Given that the sheriff's office was already investigating his management of the association, bankruptcy would probably make his legal problems worse, not better. The foreclosure process moved forward smoothly. Arthur tried to challenge it in court, but he was representing himself and didn't understand the legal procedures well enough to mount an effective defense. Every motion he filed was either dismissed for procedural errors or denied on the merits. Meanwhile, the HOA investigation was heating up. A forensic accountant hired by the Homeowners Association had found clear evidence that Arthur had been diverting funds for personal use. The total amount was over $35,000, enough to qualify as a felony in our jurisdiction. Arthur was arrested 3 weeks before the foreclosure sale was scheduled to take place. He spent 2 days in jail before posting bond, but the criminal charges eliminated any remaining sympathy residents might have had for his situation. The foreclosure sale was held on a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. I was the only bidder, which wasn't surprising given Arthur's legal troubles and the fact that the house was heavily over-leveraged. I purchased it for $480,000, which was enough to cover Arthur's debt to me plus the other mortgage balances. When the sale was finalized, I owned Arthur's house free and clear. He had 30 days to vacate, according to state law. But I wasn't done yet. Remember all those violation fines Arthur had imposed on me and my neighbors? The total for my property alone was over $8,000. Under normal circumstances, those fines would have been difficult to challenge because Arthur had technically followed HOA procedures when issuing them. However, Arthur was no longer the HOA president. He'd been removed by a unanimous vote of the remaining board members after his arrest. The new board, led by residents who had been targeted by Arthur's enforcement campaigns, was much more reasonable about violations and fee disputes. I submitted a formal appeal of all my violation fines to the new board, including documentation of Arthur's retaliatory behavior and evidence that the fines had been issued without proper justification. The board voted to dismiss all pending fines and to refund any money that had already been collected. But here's the really satisfying part. As the new owner of Arthur's former house, I was entitled to vote on all HOA matters. And as someone who had been subject to Arthur's arbitrary rule enforcement, I was very interested in making sure the association's new guidelines were clear and fairly applied. The first item of business for the new board was establishing consistent standards for architectural modifications. We voted to approve a comprehensive list of eco-friendly improvements that would be automatically permitted without individual review. Rain capture systems, solar panels, electric vehicle charging stations, and energy-efficient landscaping were all added to the approved list. We also implemented new financial controls requiring board approval for any expenditure over $500 and monthly reporting of all association funds. The days of one person controlling HOA finances without oversight were over. Arthur's moving day was set for a Friday in late spring. I drove by the house that morning to see how things were going. There were 2 moving trucks in the driveway and about a dozen boxes stacked on the front lawn. I parked across the street and waited. About 20 minutes later, Arthur came out of the house carrying a box of what looked like personal files. He saw my car and walked over. For a moment, I thought he might try to start another confrontation. Instead, he just stood there looking defeated. This wasn't the same arrogant man who had humiliated me at that board meeting or who had threatened me in my own driveway. This was someone who had finally realized that his actions had consequences. Arthur asked me if I was satisfied with how things had turned out. I told him that satisfaction wasn't really the point. He had used his position to bully residents and steal money from the community. The fact that he was losing his house was just the natural result of his own choices. He nodded slowly and walked back toward the moving truck. As he was loading his box, I noticed that he'd left it sitting on the grass for more than the 20-minute limit specified in the HOA rules. I walked over and handed him a violation notice I'd prepared earlier. It cited him for extended placement of personal property on common landscaping and imposed a $50 fine. At the bottom, I'd written, "The rules are the rules, Arthur." Arthur looked at the notice and actually smiled for the first time I'd ever seen. He crumpled it up and threw it in the moving truck. Then he climbed into the passenger seat and drove away without looking back. That evening, my wife and I walked through our new house for the first time. Arthur's obsessive attention to detail was evident everywhere. The hardwood floors were pristine, the paint was flawless, and every fixture was high-end and perfectly maintained. It was definitely a step up from our previous place. The master bedroom had a huge walk-in closet and a bathroom with a jetted tub. The kitchen had granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that looked like they'd barely been used. Arthur had clearly spent a fortune making this house perfect, and now we got to enjoy all of his improvements. But the best part was the lawn. Arthur's famous perfect grass, the same lawn he'd used as the standard for measuring everyone else's compliance, was now mine to maintain however I wanted. I was thinking about letting it grow out a little, maybe adding some wildflowers or native plants that would attract birds and butterflies. The neighborhood felt different now, too. Without Arthur's constant enforcement campaigns, residents seemed more relaxed and friendly. People were actually talking to their neighbors instead of worrying about violation notices. The community center was being used for social events instead of hostile board meetings. A few weeks after we moved in, the neighbors organized a block party to welcome spring. It It was the first social gathering the HOA had sponsored in years, and almost everyone attended. Kids were playing in the street, adults were sharing food and drinks, and there was live music from a local band. During the party, several residents thanked me for standing up to Arthur and exposing his financial mismanagement. They said the neighborhood felt like a real community again instead of a dictatorship. One neighbor joked that I should run for HOA president myself, but I assured her that I had no interest in power. I just wanted to live peacefully in my house without harassment. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing on Arthur's old driveway, looking out at the neighborhood we now called home. The house had cost me more than I'd originally planned to spend, but it had been worth every penny. Not just for the upgraded living space, but for the satisfaction of proving that bullies eventually meet people who won't be intimidated. My rain capture system was still working perfectly, by the way. Every time it rained, I could hear the water flowing through the underground pipes into the storage tanks. The control panel that had started this whole mess was mounted on the side of my new house, painted to match the siding exactly as originally planned. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's taking everything the other person thought they couldn't lose and making it your own. Arthur had tried to use his position and influence to drive me out of the neighborhood. Instead, he'd lost his house, his reputation, and his freedom. The criminal trial for embezzlement was scheduled for later that year. Arthur had pled not guilty, but the forensic evidence was overwhelming. His attorney was trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor seemed interested in making an example of him. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood continued to improve. The new HOA board had hired a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations, removing the temptation for any individual to abuse their authority. Monthly financial reports were published online, and all major decisions required majority approval from homeowners. Property values in our neighborhood actually increased after Arthur's departure, probably because potential buyers were no longer worried about arbitrary enforcement and hostile HOA leadership. The retention pond was cleaned up, the community center was renovated, and several common areas received new landscaping. I never saw Arthur again after moving day. I heard through neighborhood gossip that he'd moved into a small apartment across town and was working part-time at a hardware store. The criminal trial was still pending, but his attorney had managed to negotiate a plea agreement that would probably result in probation instead of jail time. In the end, Arthur's downfall wasn't caused by my investigation or even his embezzlement. It was caused by his own arrogance and inability to treat other people with basic respect. If he'd been reasonable about my rain capture system, if he'd been fair in his enforcement of HOA rules, if he'd managed association funds honestly, none of this would have happened. But Arthur couldn't resist the opportunity to abuse his power, and that ultimately cost him everything. His house, his reputation, his freedom, and his future were all sacrificed to feed his need to control and humiliate other people. As for me, I was living in the nicest house in the neighborhood, with a fully functional rain capture system and no more HOA violations. My daily fines had stopped accruing the day Arthur lost his position, and the new board had refunded every penny I'd paid. The whole experience taught me something important about dealing with bullies. Sometimes you can't reason with them or appease them. Sometimes the only language they understand is consequences. And sometimes, if you're patient and careful, you can use their own greed and arrogance against them. Arthur thought he held all the power in our little neighborhood kingdom. He thought his position as HOA president made him untouchable. He thought he could intimidate residents into compliance through excessive fines and threats. He was wrong about all of it. The last time I drove by his old apartment complex, I noticed they had their own HOA signs posted about parking restrictions and pet policies. I wondered if Arthur was following all the rules, or if he'd learned anything from losing his house to someone who knew how to fight back. Probably not. Some people never learn. But that's his problem now, not mine. I have a beautiful house, a perfect lawn, and a neighborhood full of friends who appreciate what it means to stand up for what's right. Arthur has a criminal record and a studio apartment. I'd say that's a fair trade. The next one is a malicious compliance story. England, 2015. I was sent on a week-long mandatory training course through work. I already knew the subject backwards, but my boss wanted me to get the certificate to prove to upper management that his team was 100% certificated. I was told that a train ticket would be booked, as would a hotel, bed and breakfast only. I'd have to pay for lunch and evening meals, but I would be able to claim up to £5 per day for lunch and £11.72 per day for evening meals. It was a really strange value, but I could eat easily within that limit. On the last night at the hotel, my food bill was £11 and 75 pence. 3 pence more than allowed. However, seeing as on the other nights I'd barely spent £10, I chanced that I could talk the finance people into approving it, as the total spend would still be less than allowed for the week. The Monday I returned, I completed the expense form with the receipts and handed it to my boss for approval. An hour later, I was summoned to his office. He flatly refused to sign off on the expenses as I had overspent. When I tried to explain that it was by 3 pence and that on the Monday night I had actually underspent by £2.50, I was lectured as to the reason that the limits were there and to read the policy. He sent me back to my desk and told me to resubmit. Cue malicious compliance. I read the policy regarding expenses, then I read the staff handbook, and then my contract. As it turned out, I could claim for the following: reasonable costs for calling my family in the evening, no receipt required. £5 per night for being away from my family, no receipt needed. One-off £30 for being more than 3 hours travel, offered as an incentive. Regardless of time spent on course, it was equivalent to 40 hours, my standard was 37. Travel to and from the venue was classed as being in work. That was overtime as it was out of hours and double for the Sunday. Friday, as I was late home, was considered an overnight stay. I resubmitted, making the adjustments and highlighting the sections of the policies. Where I had expected around £75 in expenses, with the extras in the policies I claimed for an extra £100. Then filled in the timesheet for the travel overtime, which granted me an additional £150 or so. The boss called me back into the office and tried to tell me that he wouldn't sign off on it, but I referred him to the policies and simply told him that if he refused, I'd go above him and maybe submit a formal complaint about him. I did take great satisfaction in reminding him that if he hadn't have told me to read the policies, then I'd have never found about all the extras. Yes, I did inform every one of my work friends. Yes, I did get all the claimed funds in my next paycheck. The next one is an entitled people story. I have no words to explain how much of a mess this birthday celebration was. My best friend turned 30 yesterday and she wanted a special celebration. Before her birthday and when we were coming up with ideas, she wanted to go to Canada for her 30th. I loved the idea, but I noticed how expensive the hotels came out to be, and when I told my friend we should book right away for a long weekend. I looked at my work schedule and that Monday that was supposed to be included in the trip suddenly became locked, so I couldn't take off that day. I told my friend, and she came up with a bunch of expensive hotels in Atlanta and Connecticut. We're going to Tokyo in February together, and I didn't want to spend all that money for the hotels she was finding. I told her that it's out of my price range, and she found an expensive hotel in NYC and insisted she'll cover my half. We're both from New York, and honestly, I found it to be a waste of money. I'm from Long Island, and she's from Brooklyn, so there's no need to spend 2 nights in an expensive hotel. But hey, it's her birthday, not mine. We had this plan that from the hotel we can go upstate and enjoy the fall. I go upstate with my parents a lot, so I know which areas are good. I suggested we go to Cold Spring and sent her a bunch of Instagram videos. She agreed to the idea and seemed excited. When we were taking the train up, she said Cold Spring doesn't seem to have many restaurants and suggested we go to Beacon for lunch. Then on our way back, go to Cold Spring. I said that sounds good. When we were exploring Beacon, we got lunch, but all she did was complain that the area was boring. We had a dinner reservation in NYC, so we lost time exploring Cold Spring. I thought she would love Cold Spring because of all the good photos she'll get for Instagram, but the whole time back home she kept commenting that she's a city girl for a reason. I feel like if she wasn't in a rush to get back to NYC, she would have loved Cold Spring. I had plans to get her cupcakes for her birthday, but she didn't like the bakery I thought of getting it from. Then she came up with a few places, which is totally fine. I thought we would be enjoying the dessert at the restaurant, but no, it had to be the hotel. She wanted to get balloons and got upset when I suggested we eat the cupcakes at the hotel. My friend is from Hong Kong while I'm just a white girl. Sometimes we talk about her culture and I'm someone that loves to learn about other people's culture, but honestly I do make the mistake of confusing Hong Kong with mainland China. So that would be things like the language, government, and other things. We do talk a lot about Hong Kong and mainland China, but yesterday I asked my friend if Hong Kong shares the same type of government as China. My friend turned to me and said in all seriousness, "You just triggered me and my whole country." I quickly apologized and told her I simply don't know these things because I thought I heard Hong Kong is a part of China's government. She continued to tell me that I'm triggering her so much right now and explained the differences. Then later that night we were hanging out with friends and the topic of China came up. My other friend confused the language style of China and Hong Kong. I said that I know it's confusing and my friend said, "Yeah, you always confuse my country with China and it really triggers me." She then continued to say, "That's like me confusing and triggering you about North and South Korea." I went quiet after that because she knows my husband is Korean and I'm very prideful towards South Korea. She then went on by saying that the US military needs to get out of South Korea and that the US ruins everything. I didn't say anything at that point and just kept to myself. The whole birthday was a disaster and I don't know if it's my fault. She didn't even thank me for the beautiful gift I got her and for lunch. I'm not looking for a thank you, but I just thought a comment about the necklace would be nice so I can know if she likes it or not. I'm worried about what's gonna happen with our trip to Tokyo because she needs to be in control and the littlest thing seems to upset her. I don't know what I did to fail as a friend for her to be so upset during her birthday. She would also go very quiet during the whole weekend, so that made me worried if I'm doing something wrong. Anyway, thank you for watching.